Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with host Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Search for us on your favorite podcast app, or you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so we can spread the word. If you would like to support us and get exclusive rewards, go to patreon.com/speakingout. Find a tier that best fits you and join as a patron of the podcast. Now let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast with host Jimmy Hinton.
And Jimmy's mom, Clara.
And a very special guest, we have Christa Brown with us. Christa, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So Christa, you are one of my heroes and have been for a long time. We've been wanting to have you on the podcast for a long time, and I can't believe we've let this much time go by without having you on. But I think for our listeners, I'm just going to let you kind of introduce yourself and talk about how you kind of became the face of confronting the Southern Baptist Church and creating a database. And I'll just let you tell a little bit of your story, just assuming that some of the listeners don't know your story.
Okay. Well, I grew up in a Southern Baptist church in Farmers Branch, Texas. Farmers Branch, man, that sounds like such a safe place, doesn't it?
It does.
but it wasn't. I was a girl of just great faith. It was my world. It was my everything. I grew up in a family for whom the word dysfunctional would probably be a kindness. And so, my faith, my church, this was really my refuge. And I was there every time the doors were open and more. The church allowed me to come in and practice the piano in the sanctuary. So I was there all the time. And eventually I was sexually abused by the youth and education pastor. I was 16. He was 28 or 29. He was married. He had a kid. I wish I could tell you how many times I was sexually assaulted. I don't know why my brain seems to fixate on that. I feel like I should know how many times, but I honestly can't. I think it must have been at least 30, maybe as many as 50. It went on for 7.5 months, at least once a week. But sometimes it happened not only on Sunday nights, but also on Wednesday nights. And then I also babysat sometimes for them. So I suspect it was more than 30, which is something that's to this day, I'm getting ancient here. And to this day, it's something that is very hard for me to wrap my head around. The grooming began earlier, at least when I was 15 or sooner. And grooming even encompassed some handsy, gropey kinds of stuff that would be criminal conduct.
Yeah.
And I guess, grooming, it is a word that kind of bothers me. That I struggle with because, when I think of grooming, I'm not that I've ever even ridden a horse, but I think of people caring for horses. I think of grooming a horse. And so that's care. That is caring. But so for me, it's like it's a word that it just does not even begin to convey the full, premeditated, cunning ferocity of what actually happens. Nevertheless, when I think about the beginning, even though I know things actually began sooner, where my mind always goes is to a long, dark road out by the old Addison Airport north of Dallas. And that was where the first full-on sexual assault happened. And I have stood on that dark road 1,000 times in my mind. When he pulled off, I was afraid, and so I got out of the car. But that was hopeless. I was doomed. Ultimately, I was pinned between the side of the car and him. And he was much taller than me and much bigger than me. There was nowhere to go. The abuse escalated from there. It happened everywhere in the church, even in the sanctuary. And every time, I think one of the hardest things for me, every time when he was done with me, what he said, he ended, what he said was, God loves you, Christa. So in my mind,
Wow.
though, God's love, I can't hear talk about God's love because it is neurologically networked with rape and trauma. I think that's just enormously damaging. As a kid, I tried to understand. I really, really did. I think what I would most hope that maybe your listeners here would try to understand is how faith itself and all of its accoutrements can become weapons. Weapons as powerful as any knife. In the beginning, I was a teenager. I balked a lot. I tried to understand. This did not make sense to me.
Yeah, how can it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he would stand over me, praying over me, gripping my shoulder, praying over me, praying that I would come to accept God's will, come to know and accept God's will. And of course, what he said God's will for me was that I should be a helpmeet for him. Prayed that I would quit resisting God's will. Always quoted Bible verses. Lean not unto thine own understanding was one of his favorites. I was being sinful by trying to understand. That's how that translates. He lectured me on how I had to stop fighting God's will, how I had to live by faith. He talked about Noah and Abraham and how these were men of great faith. And even when it didn't make any sense, they still did what God wanted. He told me to think about Mary because, after all, where would we all be now if Mary hadn't trusted God even when she couldn't understand what God's special role for her was? This all sounds so horrifically blasphemous, and I don't know what to say other than I was a kid of great faith, and ultimately I wanted to be a person of faith, and I wanted to be of strong faith, and I became convinced this is what it meant. I actually printed out a list of some of the Bible verses he used to use against me. I won't go through the whole list, but just like one example, he would use this: "Be not conformed to the world." What that translated as was my attempts to understand that how could this make sense, because the world would say that this is very wrong. But his response was, "Be not conformed to the world." And of course, that's just so perverse.
Yeah.
But things grew worse. He grew more aggressive. When I cut my hair, he got really furious, very upset with me. And I just began to fall apart. My piano teacher was the music minister at the church. And finally, one day, I had my piano lesson in the church sanctuary. I just absolutely, completely lost it. I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. I was crying uncontrollably. And what I told the music minister was that I had had an affair. And that was my word. I had an affair with the youth and education pastor. And I was terrified I was going to hell. And the music minister told me I should never speak of it to anyone else. And many years later, I learned that actually the music minister knew about it even before I had broken down. He knew about it because the youth and education pastor had talked with him about it, told him that he was afraid someone had seen him with me. And the music minister had simply basically, done a Matthew 18 routine and told him, go and sin no more. And meanwhile, then the abuse was allowed to escalate even more. That was just devastating for me to learn that he had actually known even sooner.
Yeah.
But after after I had that breakdown, then he did move on to another Southern Baptist church, a bigger church. He had a better position. I'm sure it paid more money. His career was illustrious. Continued. But the church, that I grew up in, my childhood church, gave him a big reception. Everyone brought their best casseroles. The senior pastor preached from the pulpit about what a great man of God he was and how we had all been so fortunate and blessed to have him.
Did the senior pastor know too?
Yes, I didn't know that at the time. Well, he told me to rededicate my life to Christ. So yeah, I figure he probably did know.
Yeah.
Years later, I learned that in fact he did know. And I figure all the deacons knew too. That kind of is something I finally sorted out. But for me at the time, I then was made to apologize to the youth pastor's wife, which I did. I apologized for what I had done and begged her to forgive me. And she said she would pray for me. And then right before he left town, the youth pastor made me kneel in his office and once again, hand gripping my shoulder, standing over me, praying for what seemed like eternity, that God would cast Satan from me.
Wow.
And I was just absolutely terrified. I didn't understand how I had ever harbored Satan to begin with. That may have been the most horrifying part in all of it. I was absolutely terrified. And I didn't talk about it more after that. Why would I? Why would I want anyone to know that I harbored Satan?
Right. Yeah.
But,
yeah, absolutely.
Fast forward years and years later, when my own daughter began to reach about the same age I had been, it was as though everything in me just unraveled. It was like this, I had this box of horribles up there on a dusty, dark back shelf in my brain, and it all came falling off the shelf, and I couldn't put anything back in the box. And when I learned, as a mother, it was just impossible for me to imagine that people wouldn't want to know about this man. And when I learned that the same music minister, my old piano teacher, was still there at my same childhood church, I thought for sure, years have gone by. I thought he would be glad to hear from me. I thought he would want to help me. I thought he would, I don't know, times have changed a little. I thought he would, really welcome the opportunity to try to do something about this. I have never been more wrong in my life. I was totally wrong. He said all over again that I had no business speaking about it, and he and the church threatened to sue me. Preemptively threatened to sue me. It was like a preemptive nuclear strike for me. It was just,
yeah.
It completely floored me, and it was very effective for quite a while because I didn't want that. I just didn't want that. Besides, I was simultaneously just trying to deal with all of this that was happening with me personally, just this unfolding of this box of horrible memories. But finally, I did sort of rally. And over the course of the next year, I wrote to 18 Southern Baptist leaders, high Southern Baptist leaders in 4 different states, 18 men. And not one of them would help me. Not one of them would do anything. Most of them completely ignored me. I wrote to the Southern Baptist Convention headquarters in Nashville, and they wrote back that they had no record that he was still in ministry. And, for a while, I took some comfort from that. I didn't want to mess with this.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
So,
What
so
survivor does?
yeah.
Yeah,
So I thought,
yeah.
great, he's not in ministry anymore. But then, things happened and I became suspicious. And ultimately, I did track him down. And he was still in ministry and had been all along, had been in children's ministry in very, very, very prominent churches, churches of the former Southern Baptist Convention president, church of the former Florida Baptist Convention president. It was impossible for me to imagine that there was no one among those 18 people who had known that he was still in ministry. It was absolutely impossible.
Yeah, yeah.
And so eventually I myself did file a lawsuit against the church. And I got proof of what people had in fact known, proof from the music minister, proof from the church itself, proof from the testimony about the senior pastor. He was dead by now, but he had known too. Proof from the Baptist General Convention of Texas. So, my account of what was done to me is well substantiated. I would say no one ever disbelieved me from the get-go. I think everyone knew it was true, but they just didn't care. To the extent they did care, the only thing they cared about was trying to bully and intimidate me.
And that included they sent some pretty high power attorneys after you too.
Yes.
What I would consider retaliation.
Yes.
And by the way, I'm going to put a plug in now. I'll put one in throughout the podcast. But this is Christa's book, This Little Light, Beyond a Baptist Preacher Predator and His Gang. Excellent book.
It is so good.
Christa,
so
I think
excellent. Yes.
It is. And as a pastor myself, I think this should be required in every single seminary across all denominations in our country and beyond. It is that powerful and that good.
Well, thank you so much. For anyone who's interested in my story, of course, it tells more of the details, but I hope that in the long run, the way it might be helpful for people is I also made an attempt in the book to document the early advocacy efforts in the Southern Baptist Convention. And so I hope it may be useful for other advocates because these patterns keep repeating themselves.
Yes.
We get major media exposure, and then the response is committees and nice words and glossy brochures and never anything substantive. And I hope that maybe that part of the book will be helpful long after I'm gone, that other advocates will see the patterns so that they'll know, this isn't the first time. It's just not.
So I want to ask this question because I want to hear it from your own lips. You have never been invited to speak, correct, at the Southern Baptist Convention?
Oh, correct. No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
And in fact, Augie Boto wrote a letter, back in 2006 I think 2006, late 2006, when I was just beginning to advocate for a database. And back then I still believed that if they just understood, they would do something. But Augie Boto squarely wrote back. I mean, he was angry, and the letter ended, "Further discourse between us will not be profitable or fruitful, productive or fruitful." Yeah. So no one has ever wanted to hear from me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I had written about For Such a Time as This rally from was that 2018, and how you guys were like pushed to the far corner. It was by dumpsters. It was by, it was the bus pickup and drop off. So it was noisy. It was like this tiny little section.
Correct.
And I'd written about this. I wrote a blog post about this, that none of the leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention even acknowledged that you guys were outside, first of all. In fact, Rachel Denhollander, in her talk at the convention, she said, there's a group of people outside right now. And she was referencing you guys. And she said, there's a reason why they're upset and why they feel neglected and why you guys have pushed them to the margins, and intentionally not listened to their stories. There's something to that effect, but she had addressed that, and I thought that was really telling for me, enough that I wrote a full blog post about it. That not only were you especially not acknowledged, who has done so much legwork to shine a light on predators who are in the pulpit. Not only did they ignore you, but they literally pushed you guys to this far corner that basically sent a message: you guys are trash.
Yes, exactly. No, it's very symbolic, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah. And I would also say, I mean, those of us who were there, ironically, I think, God knows why, but I think we are the ones who still maintain some hope that this faith group can find it within itself to care. But there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other survivors who have long since completely and utterly and totally given up hope.
Yeah.
And that may indeed be by far the more rational response.
Yeah. Sadly, you're not wrong. Yeah. Well, talk to us, tell our listeners about what led you to start StopBaptistPredators.org, and how difficult that journey was. Because I don't get the impression you had a whole lot of support. Yeah, you were kind of on this little island by yourself, and they had backhoes and were like cutting your island off and hoping to push you out into the ocean, to push you far, far away. So talk to us about StopBaptistPredators.org.
Well, thank you so much, Jimmy, because I think your analogy there is very apt. This was before Me Too, before Church Too. And so you're absolutely right. There was just very, very, very little support. The three things really kind of motivated me, prodded me to do that, to start StopBaptistPredators.org, which was both kind of my own database of clergy that, as I became aware of them, abusive clergy, and also a blog on Baptist clergy sex abuse. I did a little op-ed piece that I got published in the Dallas Morning News. And I swear, at the time I did this, I thought, okay, I'll just have my little say. I'll say my piece. It'll all be over with. I can go back and live in peace. I can walk away. And that's all I really wanted. And so I was so grateful when the Dallas Morning News published it, right? Because I thought, that's it, I'm done. But then, my email address was at the end of the op-ed piece, and my inbox was absolutely flooded, just completely flooded. It took me over 6 weeks just to catch up and make kind of a bare minimum response to people. And that was when I really, really began to see the horrific extent of the problem. So there was that. And then I still just never could get over the fact that 18 Southern Baptist leaders could know and choose to do nothing. And I couldn't get over that. As a mother, I couldn't get over that. It was obvious it was a huge safety gap. And I had to do something about that. But of course, hundreds of people have experienced the same thing I have, and to this day still do. And then there was the fact that by then, this was 2006, I had already begun writing letters, not just, dealing with my own story, but beginning advocacy work, writing letters urging the creation of a Southern Baptist Convention database. And I thought that a website and blog would be a vehicle to help advocate for that, to get attention for it. And back then, I really, really still thought, my own naivety here is kind of a progression. I I really, really still thought that if only I could show the extent of the problem, that surely they would do something. And I was wrong. I was really wrong about that, because it's not a matter of them not understanding the extent of the problem. It is a lack of will on their part. And so I was just flat out wrong about that. You asked how difficult it was. And I would just say I was absolutely, completely unprepared for the depth and the breadth of the fury and misogyny that I encountered. I got heaps of hate mail, obscenity-laced rants, hate-filled screeds, just a few real threats. It was really awful for a long, extended period of time. My husband took to answering my own cell phone so that I would not wind up answering the phone to have someone unleashing, some barrage at me.
Was it things like you're ruining the reputation of the church, you're ruining a good pastor's reputation? Was it things like that, or was it like threats, personal threats against you? What were they saying?
It was both. I mean, it was that kind of stuff. You're hurting the church. Those were kind of the mild ones. You're Antichrist, all the name calling. You're Jezebel. There were a few threats. There was even one threatening to cut off my head, and that was actually sent to 6 people. I was one of 6. I can't even begin to tell you how upsetting these things were. And the truth is, I place much of the responsibility for this awfulness at the doorstep, at the feet of top Southern Baptist leaders, because they were saying things like, calling me an opportunist, calling me an evildoer, saying I was just as reprehensible as a sex criminal, accusing me of making false charges. And I think when the very top leaders in the largest faith group, Protestant faith group in the country, when they say these kinds of things, then it's only a few steps beyond. There are other people out there who will take that further. And so they incite and foster that kind of horrific hatefulness. I'm, as you might guess, I tend to be kind of stubborn by nature.
I haven't noticed. I mean,
so for a long, long time, I just dug in my heels, and I was just absolutely determined that I wouldn't let it all get to me. I thought they would win. That would be letting them win. But once again, I would say in hindsight here that, I was just wrong. It did get to me.
Christa, I'm going to pose a question here. Do you think that the Southern Baptist Church has learned anything from all of this? No,
I do not. No. Well,
I mean, most of us are listening and in awe when you say 18 men knew about this. They are the spiritual leaders of the largest faith-based organization, or whatever you want to call it, and they totally ignored, didn't care, lashed out, you name it, and it happened to you as though you were the one in the wrong. And it's like, I'm left with my head I'm like blown away.
I think you're absolutely right, though. I to this day believe that if ordinary parents in the pews, just the ordinary people trying to take good care of their kids, if ordinary people realize that 18 Southern Baptist leaders knew and did nothing, and I'm just one case out of hundreds.
Right.
But I think people would be truly horrified if they really understood that. But as for what Southern Baptist leaders have learned, I kind of think that really most of what they have learned is just how to do better PR. They have become more cunning in their PR tactics. They've learned to be friendly to the secular media and not to, label them as yellow journalism, which is what former SBC president Frank Page did back when ABC 2020 did an expose on them. Sadly, that's what I see. I think that is pretty much what they've learned.
I agree with you 100%. Wow. I don't ever want to speak badly about other advocates, because I wouldn't do that. They're out there. They're doing the hard work. A lot of them are survivors themselves. But it is, as somebody who also has been in this for a long time, and I know church leadership. I'm a pastor myself. I know church leadership. Yeah. I know the politics. I know all the stuff that happens behind closed doors. I know all the political chess moves. I know that stuff. I know it well. I see it. I live it. And that's just in a small church setting. I can't imagine what it's like in the biggest Protestant denomination. It's what we experience on steroids, magnified times 50. I know what it's like. So for me, I've always been really hesitant to jump on board and say, well, now we have the summit, they came out with that, and J.D. Greear, he's really gonna lead the way. And I was interviewed early on by CBN News, and I was asked the question about J.D. Greear when he first came out, and he's really going to stick it to them, and he's going to stand on the side of survivors, and he's going to clean house and all this stuff. And that was right at the time that the Houston Chronicle had published this bombshell report, and J.D. Greear acts surprised. And my response, I think, probably caught the reporters off guard a little bit, but I said, I'm not buying it. J.D. Greear has known that this has been a problem in the church way before he ever became the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. He's known about this, and now he's acting surprised because the Houston Chronicle published a bombshell story. And he's like, oh my goodness, I can't believe there's so many victims in the church. We got to do something about it. I'm not buying it. He's known about this.
He has, absolutely.
Yeah. And, there are some pretty disturbing things, I think, that are coming out of J.D. Greer's own church. Yes. And I wrote an article about their policy, about how they coddle abusers, registered sex offenders. They coddle them, and they keep their identities hidden intentionally. It's written in their policy, and this is the same policy that's being touted as the model policy to follow for the I forget the name of what's their curriculum. The
Caring Well.
Yeah, Caring Well. Thank you. So that's what prompted me to write that blog that I wrote in December of 2019, and that went completely viral. And I posted big chunks of that policy right into my blog site. So it's not like it was my interpretation of their policy. It's written in black and white that they're saying, we ask our members to sacrifice the peace of mind that comes with knowing that who the sex offenders are in the church. We're asking you to sacrifice and give up that peace of mind. And what they're saying is, we're going to keep their identities hidden. Us leaders have it. We've got it covered. Trust us. Don't worry about it. And we're asking you to give up that peace of mind. We're telling you to sacrifice that peace of mind because we've got this. It's horrific and dangerous.
Yeah. Jimmy, you did an absolutely fabulous job in articulating the practical ramifications of that policy at J.D. Greear Summit Church. And I am totally in agreement with you. And I think, once again, that it is very, very telling, because no doubt there are a lot of Southern Baptist churches who do exactly the same thing in terms of coddling abusers. But there it was in a written policy, which I think people have to see.
It's the model policy.
Yeah.
It's the model policy. It's not like it's a random policy that they pulled. This is at the president of the SBC convention at his church. And they're touting this. They put it in the curriculum.
Yes, this is a
model
feature.
Policy.
This is a feature, not a flaw of their system. And it goes to show, because otherwise, why would they put it in writing? They absolutely believe that what they are doing is right. And that shows how extraordinarily detached they are from the mainstream of expert opinion on this.
Yeah.
No, but you did a brilliant job, Jimmy. It was absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think, it didn't surprise any of us who have not been as optimistic as others. It didn't surprise us that in June, there was a big controversy over a hiring at guess which church.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Summit Church hired,
Brian Lawrence.
Yeah, thank you. Brian Lawrence, who blatantly covered up abuse. And victims of his brother-in-law, which he covered up when he was in Memphis, victims of his brother-in-law had reached out to the hiring committee at Summit Church and warned them and said, we want to go on record saying that this man buried evidence. He took the cell phone that contained the evidence. He joked about or talked about dumping it in the river, the Mississippi River. He destroyed evidence willfully. Brian Lawrence is a train wreck and should have been the last person that Summit Church hired, but they hired him anyway. And then they did damage control. And I literally just looked yesterday because I was like, I haven't heard much about Brian Lawrence since that all blew up. I went on Summit Church's website yesterday, and there he is on the staff page. He's still there.
I would just say in the middle of this, for any survivors who are kind of beginning their journey, who are sort of new to this, obviously, I've been doing this for a long time, and I have become, I think rightfully so, very, very, very skeptical for very obvious reasons, I think. Yes. But I would also say I deeply and wholly understand, and I think it speaks to the good in people, that so many survivors try so hard to give religious leaders the benefit of the doubt. Mm-hmm. And, that's not a bad thing. Look at all the mistakes I made all these times when I was so naive and truly believing of them. So all I'm saying is I hope survivors will never kick themselves for that, because we've all been there, we've all done it. And really it's because we're good people.
And I want to add to that, Christa, too. There are leaders out there who are good leaders who will listen, who will take action, who will, when they hear you pleading with them. Yeah.
Obviously do. Yeah.
But I'm not alone. I'm not the only one, not by a long shot. So I want survivors to know that too. That I don't want them to hear this podcast and be like, well, this just proves what's the point in speaking up. There are leaders who will listen and who will take action, who they're not going to try to save their own reputation or, make their church look good and throw the victims under the bus. There are good leaders out there who will listen. I think the challenge becomes finding who they are. And I would probably caution survivors who are taking those first steps to not plunge into it with both feet and be like, okay, I got to tell somebody, we got to get action right now. I would say test the waters a little bit and find out who's trustworthy.
Jimmy, you give great advice. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking at the clock here. I think that we are gonna wind down this episode. We're going to have part 2 with Christa Brown. So for those who might just be tuning in, we're talking with Christa Brown, author of This Little Light. Excellent book. And in part 2, we're going to talk about some of the hope and maybe some of the things that you see coming down the pike in the very near future. And I want to hear your thoughts on that. I'm intrigued, and I definitely want to hear from you on that. So to our listeners who tuned into this episode, thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next round.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. Thank you to our patrons who make the podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker and search for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron and check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.